In 1975, all those years ago, I was given a glider flight from an obscure little airfield in East Anglia, Norfolk in East Anglia, not far from where we lived at the time. And I got really hooked into the world of gliding and flying generally. And at that time, the airfield that I flew from was a old US Air Force base called Tibenham. And it was part of 67 airfields in East Anglia that the Americans used in World War II. In those days, it was more or less complete. We had the control tower and we had all the perry tracks and everything, apart from the hangars. The only thing that had gone were the original World War II hangars. As you can see, all those black dots on that image are airfields. The Americans were basically in this area here. The Norfolk bit was mainly B-24s and the Suffolk bit was mainly B-17s. And around the coastal areas were the fighter bases, the P-47s and Lightnings and Mustangs. So this was the base more or less complete in 1975 when I started flying. The gliding club itself started in 1969 and leased the old airfield from a local farmer. This is the image of it in 1943 when it was built. The main areas are the living quarters over on the right-hand side, the bomb dump and the 3 runways in a configuration, the main runway being the long one, which runs roughly north-south. The Americans in East Anglia were part of the 8th Air Force, and there was about 200,000 US personnel based in the locale at the 69 airfields that they occupied and other sites like headquarters, hospitals, etc. Tibenham had about a population of about 3,000 US personnel in World War II, as most of the bases did. Here's a picture of the old wartime base at Tibenham, dated 1944. As you can see, it's still got the original buildings. Well, this is what it was like in 1975 when I arrived. You can see the greenhouse has gone from the top and the windows have all been smashed and vandalised. We used to get loads of American veterans coming back to show their families where they were stationed in World War II. Amongst the many visitors we used to get was Jimmy Stewart, who was stationed at Tibenham from December 1943 through to July 44. And here's Jimmy Stewart walking from the NCO's mess hall in the background, briefing for a mission. And here he is at a visit in 1975. So 31 years later, and we're strapping him into a glider there, and this is him leaning against the wall of the control tower. These are other people who flew not necessarily from Tibenham, but you've got Clark Gable, Walter Mattu, who flew from Old Buckingham, and the guy on the left was Joe Kennedy Jr., who was stationed at Firstfield, which is about 5 miles away from Tibenham. And he was killed on what was called an Aphrodite mission, which is when they used to get old war-weary bombers, filling them up with explosive to fly them remotely to targets on the continent. Wasn't very successful. Joe Kennedy and his co-pilot took off, got to the coast, went to arm the bomb load, and the whole issue blew up. This was the assembly ship at Tibenham. Each base took an old bomber and painted it in a garish colour. This particular one was orange and black, and they would fly in a pattern. You can see this is all the patterns from all the different bases. Would fly round and round and round, and everybody would formate up on it, and then having formated up as a squadron, they would then formate up as a group, and the groups would then come together to form a wing, and off they would trundle to the various targets. Crews were divided into teams of 4 officers, usually 2 crews to a hut in the Quonset or concrete huts or these Nissen huts. The enlisted men were technical sergeants and staff sergeants, and there was about 6 of them to a crew. These were mainly the gunners, the tail, ball, 2 waist gunners and a mid-upper turret gunner come engineer. They lived also 2 crews to a hut, like these corrugated ones. Pretty cold, horrible existence. Here's the NCO bar built into one of them, and them delivering the beer. This is an image of Glenn Miller playing at the T2 hangar based at Tibenham. He performed at lots of the local bases before being missing in action, flying to another tour in the liberated portion of France at that time. This is one of the 2 T2 hangars that we had on Tibenham. They did the main maintenance in the hangars, largely major repairs. We could get about 5 aircraft in the hangar at any one time. This is a typical crew. You've got your 4 officers in the front. This particular one, the guy second from the left, is a guy called Chuck Walker, and he was alive until only 2 years ago. And he did his 30th mission in an aircraft called Bunny, which coincided with the Bunny's 100th mission. And here he is being congratulated when they did it. This is him 2 years ago at the memorial at Tibenham, about 3 months after this image was taken. He sadly passed on. And this is what happened to Bunny. He wasn't flying it at the time, but with another crew, she wound up as a crumpled heap off the end of the main runway at Tibenham. 4 of the crew were killed, and the others badly injured. She was the longest surviving aircraft at Tibenham. Of the 3,000 people who were stationed at Tibenham during World War II, 554 were actually killed in action. 15 guys were killed in service, which means basically they were run over or something dropped on them. In fact, 2 of them were killed by an American bomber accidentally letting a couple of bombs go. They were the only casualties on the base by American bombs. 422 wound up as POWs at the guests of the Germans. 39 managed to be interned, which was probably the best option of the lot, and 44 managed to evade the Germans. Life expectancy for an 8th Air Force aircrew was largely dependent when you were here. If you were here at the start of the American operations in early 43, you stood about a 1 in 3 chance of being killed. As the war progressed and missions started to be flown more into deeper Germany, that went up to about 1 in 2. Then later in the war, when long-range fighters came on service, like the Mustang, and they didn't have to do unescorted bombing raids into deep, darkest Germany, the life expectancy went up considerably. But that was then countermanded by the fact that they increased the number of missions from 25 to eventually 35 missions that you had to do. So all in all, you probably stood about a 1 in 2 chance of being shot down. Of that 1 in 2 chance of being shot down, you then stood about a 1 in 2 chance again of being able to get out of the aircraft. And if you then survived that and you managed to land up in hostile territory, you then stood about a 1 in 10 chance of being killed by the local populace. If it was in Germany, you stood a better chance, obviously, if you came down in France or Belgium. So, having flown at Tibenham for lots of years and spent my idle days fudging around on the airfield as well, picking up bits of broken aeroplane and other artefacts left behind by the Americans, I became sort of like the airfield historian, really. I was sat at dinner one night looking after a group who were over here for the one of the 2nd Air Division memorial jaunts over to the UK. This guy called Reg Minor, who was a pilot on the Kassel mission, proceeded to tell me about it. The Kassel mission resulted in the greatest loss experienced by a single group from one airfield in a day's battle in the whole of the 8th Air Force's history. Of the 39 aircraft that were scheduled to fly that day, 1 never got off the ground and 3 did take off but had technical problems and came back to Tibenham. Of the 35 that went actually on the mission, 25 of them were shot down over Germany. 3 were so badly damaged that they only made it back to France and Belgium. Two managed to stagger over the channel and land at Manston in Kent, where there was an emergency airfield with huge great runways. And one nearly got home and crashed at Old Buckenham in Norfolk, which is about 4 miles away from Tibenham. And the remaining 4 aircraft came back. Of the 370 guys who were scheduled to go on the mission that day, 9 never left Tibenham. 117 were killed. 121 were captured and made POW. Only 42 got back to Tibenham that day, and another 63 landed elsewhere and eventually made their way home. The cause of the disaster was basically a perfect storm of errors in navigation, errors in interpretation of the weather. And basically the 445th Bomber Group got split off from the other 2 bomber groups in the wing and went off on their own and left their escorting fighters behind. They walked into a German fighter group of over 150 aircraft and just got absolutely massacred. The following day, there was only 1 aircraft that had been on the mission previously, serviceable to fly, and they managed to drag another 9 aircraft in from borrowing from other bases. And the following day, 10 aircraft joined in another raid back to the same place. This time they got away unscathed and there was no further casualties. But it shows the courage that the guys had to actually climb into the remaining aircraft that they'd begged, borrowed and stolen and go back knowing full well what had happened to all their friends the previous day. I decided to write a little piece for the Gliding Club website for the 75th anniversary of the raid, and it grew a bit into being a little booklet. And from that it grew into a full-blown book, which is called The Kassel Raid. I sent it off to a publisher and they decided to publish it, and it's now freely available on all good bookstalls. Having written the book, I still do tours around Tibenham for those people, and I actually now do tours abroad as well for other purposes like Normandy and the Dam Busters raid and things like that. It's become quite a hobby, really.